South Dakota. I'm director of the foundation at Southeast Technical College and also the chair-elect of the South Dakota Humanities Council. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the South Dakota Humanities Council, which produces the annual Festival of Books. We hope that you'll enjoy the festival and that you'll provide feedback about this year's event. The link in our online survey is available at sdbookfestival.com. There's a QR code. We'd really appreciate it. As you know, the South Dakota Festival is free and we want to keep it that way. So consider making a tax-deductible donation. This is a wonderful organization that does wonderful things and could be worthy of your support, and we hope you will consider that. The festival would not be possible also without the generous support of numerous organizations and individuals, which you can find on the back of the magazine. They have donated wonderful resources to make this available to all of us for free. So today's program is called with Lori Walsh, South Dakota Public Radio, own Lori Walsh, Rethinking Our Relationship with Water. So please, everybody, give a nice warm welcome to our guest, who Lori will welcome to us, and thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. Special thanks to the Oscar Larson staff for adjusting to this lovely configuration. We are not live today, but we are going to record this panel discussion for future broadcast on SDPB. The show is called In the Moment. You'll be able to find it online probably in a week or two and be able to share what you heard today. So that's causing the SDPB engineers and producers to do a little extra duty and the staff here to do an extra assist. So just thank you so much for all of that. What we will do then is I think I will introduce everybody here to you now so that you have a sense of who our guests are, and then we'll start the recording part of the day. And my computer didn't charge, so you get me looking at my phone for bios, which is an adventure waiting to unfold for everyone involved. This is my friend Don Carr. He has investigated and written about America's worst polluters for national environmental groups like EWG and Earth Justice. As a freelance journalist, he has written for Sierra Magazine, the Food and Environmental Reporting Network, Politico, the Huffington Post, Grist, Civil Eats, and the Washington, D.C. City Paper. He lives in Minneapolis, and his debut novel, which is a page-turner thriller, is called The Midnight Rambler, and it was published in December. Next to him, we have David O'Hara, professor of environmental studies, religion, and philosophy at Augustana University, where he directs the programs in environmental studies and sustainability. He was part of a team that created IBM's Call for Code Clean Water Challenge, engaging almost 30,000 university students around the world in developing tech for good that helps ensure access to clean water for all. He studies the way deep values affect our water architecture, and he teaches about freshwater ecosystems. Travis Entenman is the managing director of Friends of the Big Sioux River, executive director of Northern Prairie's Land Trust, and he sits on the board of supervisors at the Minnehaha Conservation District. He received his bachelor's degree in journalism from South Dakota State University and his master's in environmental law and policy from the Vermont Law School. He lives in Sioux Falls with his wife, Hannah, and 2 children. That part's cut off in this. So there was 2 kids and a bunch of other stuff. You would have to add that in at that point. And then we have Jay Gilbertson, the longtime manager of the East Dakota Water Development District based in Brookings. He has worked on a wide range of water and natural resource issues in 40 plus years of public sector employment in South Dakota. He's the chair of the State Non-Point Source Pollution Task Force. He's a state director for the SD Association of Rural Water Systems and consigliere to numerous water resource entities. Now we'll just double check with my crew that we're ready to begin and record, and we'll go ahead and get started. And the reason that we wanted to get this panel together, especially when the Festival of Books is in Brookings, east of the river, is because we had a rather historic year of flooding where people were rethinking where houses are built, how urban development works, what the intersection between agriculture and the city of Sioux Falls and residential areas is, and of course, the natural world. Jay Gilbertson, I'd like to start with you and tell me, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Tell me the significance of the flooding events and what you've been hearing from people about how that is impacting, if at all, the dialogue about rivers and streams and water.
All right. Well, yeah, thanks for the heads up. I appreciate that. That's good.
That's what I'm here for.
Yeah, the certainly the rainfall event last June was an eye opener for a lot of folks. 10 to 15 inches of rain over a swath that went from Mitchell to Worthington, Minnesota, is just an unprecedented amount of rain. And as a result, the watershed of the Big Sioux River, primarily, which covered pretty much all of that, uh, saw record flooding in almost every location where we have information about what it's been like before. The the severity of that event uh, probably had was mostly simply a function of the uniqueness of that activity. People talk about the 100-year flood event or whatever like that. That was, who knows what it was, but it was the kind of thing that isn't supposed to happen terribly frequently, or at least statistically, that's what it means. And for a lot of the folks who were impacted by it, even if everything had been done correctly, most things are not built, designs are not put in place, uh, local ordinances are not enacted with the idea that they would withstand a 500 to 1,000 year event. They're meant for 10-year, 25 or 50-year events. And if it gets over that, well, yeah. And the reason is that you to design a dam that would hold 1,000-year rainfall event, the dam would be ginormous, and nobody wants to pay for that. And so we certainly did see a lot of damage, particularly in the very lowest part of the basin, North Sioux City, McCook Lake. Those folks got hit with a lot. Um, Again, most of that was, to me, attributed simply to the fact that we had a lot of rain, and that's what happens. But certainly, development has not helped things. Everybody wants to live by the lake.
Mm.
Everybody wants to live by the river, and the river likes to be in those places too every once in a while. And we got to see a lot of that in June.
And we want to live by the lake in a way that's not necessarily a log cabin anymore. Maybe we want a nicer home by the lake, something where we can invite families for a holiday and a party. And so the structures have also gotten more expensive.
Oh, certainly, certainly, yeah. What would have been might have been a cabin 50 years ago, you know, no insulation on the whole bit, now is a full-time home. And maybe the folks who built the original place or their kids have turned that into a full-time, 24/7, 365 occupied building. And you want all the amenities that go with that, and would prefer not to have any of the inconveniences that come with living next to a body of water that might go up or down or left and right whenever it feels like it.
Yeah.
And so,
Travis, what were you seeing this year during that historic flooding and what happens to the Big Sioux River when that much rain comes through? Just the basics of that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, in addition to all the damage that was caused, there was, we do see increase in water quality issues. We're having more runoff. The rain is the water is picking up more stuff that's on our landscape. But it also, I think, is a showcase of maybe what is our future in terms of these rain events. We had historic rainfall in 18 and 19, and then we had a few years of drought, and now we just had another historic rainfall. So are we going to be seeing these types of peaks and valleys in the future, and how are we going to deal with that? And that's kind of more what we are seeing or talking about a little bit more, is like, how are we going to position ourselves as a community to help play offense on those type of scenarios, because we'll probably see those again. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Dr. O'Hara, Why are we seeing those things again and again? This is, have the rivers been reset? Is the climate reset? Or is this a fluke? We got that much rain this year. Let's not get too worked up over it. Help us put that into context scientifically.
Yeah, let's be clear, it's not a fluke. We have changed the way that the river flows. We have changed the way that the water flows before it gets to the river. We've actually changed the way that the rain is falling. So Jay's right. Try to build a dam at the mouth of a river, and it's going to be extremely expensive. But think about any river as looking sort of like a hardwood tree, or for your listeners online, I'll say you can think about the mouth of the rivers being like your elbow and the tributaries of the river being like your fingers all spread out. Try to build a dam down at the bottom, and it's going to be extremely expensive. But build thousands of dams up at the top, and it's not very expensive, especially if you let nature do it, which is what it used to do. Beavers, for instance, build amazing dams and maintain them for free. And then we consider them pests and we get rid of them. This area right here, this part of South Dakota, when European settlers arrived, we had topsoil, the top two layers of the soil horizons that they were 2 to 3 feet deep, sometimes 4 feet deep, and those were sponges. And we have cleared those in order to make lawns, and then we put back a tiny little bit of topsoil, and we get rid of all the plants that would drill down, like dandelions, for instance, that would actually help us to retain water. So our topsoil that was holding the water is gone from our cities and from our small communities. We're losing it in our farmland. And we have made our cities into hardscapes that they're like raincoats. We just send the water right into the river. I'll tell you, right after that big rainfall event here, I was in Central America. I was visiting a community in Costa Rica, which was relocated about 50 years ago because of a historic flood. Their community was wiped out, and the government of Costa Rica moved them to a spot that had never had in recorded history had that kind of flooding. So they thought this is going to be a safe place for them to be. And while I was there, they got historic rainfall that wiped out nearly every road and nearly every bridge while we were there. And this community is going, what on earth do we do now? Where else can we go? One thing that we do know is that when we change the landscape, we change the rainfall. We used to say that the rain would follow the plow. That was just propaganda. What actually happens, though, is the way that we cut down trees or build hardscape and so on, that actually changes the surface temperature. It changes what we call the albedo of the surface of the land, whether it reflects light or retains the heat. And that has a direct effect on local weather systems. So no, this is not a fluke. We have designed this without realizing it.
Don Carr, your book Midnight Rambler is fiction. It follows an environmental cop essentially. It's a thriller looking at people committing crimes. We could all hear about your book a lot, but you've also done a lot of other work as a journalist. Based on what you've heard so far, where do you want to jump in with something that maybe we haven't discussed yet?
Well, I will say, growing up in Sioux Falls and growing up on the Big Sioux River, there's a couple stories I like to tell. One is as being a camp counselor at Leif Erikson Day Camp with children at that camp, and the river's really low there, and we'd play within the river with the kids all day long, and clumps of manure would come by, and we would just ignore them. But then the next day, 2 or 3 of your campers wouldn't show up, and we would just call it they had creek flu. And we'd all just kind of, moved on past that. And later on in high school, before like we'd go to punk shows downtown, we'd go to the falls, maybe have a couple adult beverages, but we would sit on old car batteries as like bar stools. And so to interject in this conversation, I'd like to say, the falls got cleaned up pretty well. Like it's a pretty amazing resource now. And these guys are doing all this great work upstream. I think we need to do more work upstream to kind of make that river a gem that it could be for the city of Sioux Falls.
Yeah. Travis, talk about long term as you do the testing of the water quality. And we think about the very basics. What do we want? We want clean air. We want clean water.
Sure.
And we can't even really reliably go back to that and say that we have that. How clean is the Big Sioux River over time? And what is its trajectory at this point?
Yeah, so as Dave mentioned, when Western settlers came, we had a prairie ecosystem and we had a prairie river. So there was tall grass prairie along the banks of the Big Sioux, this clear rocky bottom. With land use changes came river changes. And essentially now it's filled with our topsoil. It's when it rains or if we have high wind events, because we live in South Dakota, that is going into our water bodies, and that is forever changing our rivers. And as we develop and we have changed how we use our landscape, that has negatively so far impacted the river. Long term, though, we know how to fix this, and a lot of it is a natural based system, right? So it's putting in buffer strips along the water bodies to help filter out runoff. It's doing regenerative ag practices, so cover crops and no-till, rotational grazing type of practices. It's putting in smart infrastructure. So, like as Sioux Falls is growing, how about we think about how we are growing? Because right now, I've had many conversations with folks that feel like Sioux Falls is kind of a suburb of a suburb, right? It's just sprawl and a lot of housing, but there's no real grand theme to it. And we're going into what used to be wetlands, and that is impacting our water quality. So having all these pieces together and have some kind of, and I like to say offense and defense play here. So offensive, while we can control the aspects a little bit more as things are cheaper, instead of being reactionary 50 years down the road when we could have done something to prevent that. So long term, I think these things are happening. So there are regenerative ag practices going online. There are developers and designers and engineers putting in practices, but they're on a smaller scale. A lot of that has to do with cultural differences. A lot of it has to do with financial incentives and not enough finance for these projects. So if we put more resources to these type of projects, we're going to see an increase of participation and increased growth. I mean, it took us 100 years to get to where we are now. It's gonna take a while. It's not splashy. It's not sexy. It's not, we can't put the name on the river. If you want to donate a couple $1 million, I will work the hardest I can to change the name to whatever you want it to be. But because we can't do that, we have to just do it as a community. You wouldn't treat your backyard like this. Well, water is in public trust in South Dakota. It is our backyard. We should treat it as such.
Jay, I think you said this once on in the moment in a previous interview, and it stuck with me that if we had a different major industry, that's what we'd be talking about. If we were auto manufacturers, we'd all be up here talking about the impact of the auto industry on our quality of the river. We're an ag community. So we're not picking on ag, but our biggest industry is agriculture. These are the biggest problem solvers. These are the people who are the most invested, but also we can have some uncomfortable conversations about modern ag practices and how we need to rethink them.
Uh,
Am I
yeah,
am I misquoting you?
no, no, you're doing it. Yeah, my standard spiel is, this is not an indictment of agriculture, but yeah, the reality is that, in the Big Sioux River Basin, you take out, metropolitan Sioux Falls. Um, yeah, our industry is ag. That's it. There isn't anything else out there. We do have a few, we've got 3M and Larson here in Brookings, but they're small potatoes compared to everything else. And so it's no big surprise that our problems are largely tied to agricultural activities. Again, that's not saying they're bad. It's just that's all we've got. If we had a Dow chemical plant, we could point fingers at them maybe but we don't. So it's agriculture. As have been mentioned, there are programs available trying to sort of retrofit things. I mean, one solution to cleaning up the river would be to have everybody leave the basin. I mean, we are the problem. And if you'd like it to go back the way it was 200 years ago, there's a real easy solution. Everybody pack up and go somewhere else. The river will heal itself pretty quickly. But if we're going to stay here, and I think most of us would like to do that, we're going to have to start doing things differently. I'd like to see a much more proactive approach to things, particularly at the state and federal level, the regulatory side. The tendency is to wait until something breaks and then fix it. Because if I try and work with somebody in a proactive manner, telling them you have to stop doing what you're doing because that's leading to bad things, tell Travis, stop what you're doing. He's going to look at me like, why? I'm not doing anything wrong. Nothing's broken. And so even though we see trends in a number of things, look at nitrates in the Big Sioux River, they're very, very low. And that has an impact on drinking water, but they're climbing over time. The trend is very clear. They're going up. Now, it may be 100 years before they get to problematic stage, but it's way easier to address those issues today than it will be when we have to tear it all out 100 years from now. The ounce of prevention, pound of cure thing.
What's a reasonable and inspiring goal? And I'm thinking of the talking about levels and charts and graphs might not capture the imagination of people. The mayor of Paris going for a swim before the Olympics come and before athletes start getting sick. But the PR moment where we say, we did this, I'm going to go for a swim in it. I don't think anybody's going to be swimming in the Big Sioux anytime soon. But what is a reasonable and inspiring goal, Jay?
We can lower the numbers, and that is happening in many cases. Part of the problem that we have in some ways, getting the word out and doing better communication in that regard is that if you look at, say, our state report card, or the report card state puts out, it's called the integrated report. It comments on the condition of our rivers and lakes, and basically it's a pass-fail grade. It's either okay or it isn't. And there's no shades of gray in between. And so if you are below the threshold for drinking water and nitrate 10 parts per million, if there's no detectable, you're great. If it's 9.99, you get the same thumbs up number. Similarly, if you go over that, if you're a little over or you're over by orders of magnitude, that shows up the same. Where that would come into play, I think, and we need to do a better job of talking about this, is for things like nitrate, where the numbers are low, but the trend is going up, or bacteria, which is our biggest problem in eastern South Dakota. In a lot of the places where work is being done, the overall trend is lowering numbers, but they're still too high. They're above the magic number, therefore they show up as simply a thumbs down. And we need to get that message across. I work quite a bit with the legislature and get asked that question. We've spent X million dollars in the Big Sioux Basin. Why isn't it better? It is better. It's just the most common metric we're using doesn't reflect that in any way, shape, or form.
When we talk about rethinking our relationship with water, and I think, we said 100 years it took us to get here, or 250 years ago it looked like this. David O'Hara, clearly they're Indigenous people who've lived here longer than 250 years. Talk about your work and listening and learning about ways of thinking that are from cultures that none of us represent on this panel right now, but that all of us should be, at least not that I'm aware of. Please correct me if I'm wrong there, but that all of us should be thinking about that in this context.
Yeah, I'll mention two things. You're pointing out that none of us up here on this panel are at least strong representatives of Indigenous thinking, and that's right. And we're also, I'm just going to say this out loud, old. That is to say, we're all over 20. There's a lot of really
Travis.
Well, except for Travis. One of the resources that is available to us is the creative thinking of young people and good education. You mentioned before that part of my work has been with IBM and with some other organizations and helping to foster innovation. And young people, you present young people with the opportunity to try new things at low risk and low cost, even just to learn about other cultures, and they'll probably bring about a whole bunch of interesting change. There are cities, major cities in the world, where if you build a house, you have to have not one, but two water systems. You have clean, fresh water coming in for drinking. And then when you use that water for things like washing your hands, that then goes for flushing your toilet. In my culture, and this is going to sound crazy to all of your listeners, but in my culture, we purify water so that it's clean enough that you could wash a baby with it, and then we use it to fill toilets. We use it to spray down sidewalks, and we use it to wash cars. I know that sounds bizarre, but that's exactly what we do in my culture. And I assume that's because we didn't have enough champagne to fill our toilets. But young people know how to look at these sorts of things and say, hey, what if we innovated on this? What's related to that, and to get back to your I think what you're trying to get at, Lori, we don't tend to think of water as part of a system. We don't tend to think of water as being part of a relationship, but every drop of water is connected to every other drop of water. The water that goes through our system here will wind up affecting the cost of seafood that comes from the Gulf of Mexico. And when people go to Cancun and they say, why is there all this sargassum all over the beach? This is really gross. It smells bad. That's seaweed that washed up on the beach. Well, it's been flourishing because we have so many ag nutrients going into our river, going into the Gulf of Mexico, and the nutrients that we put on our fields here are actually growing seaweed in the Gulf of Mexico. This is dumb. One of the things that we see in indigenous thinking really all over the world, and very strongly here in Lakota culture, this idea, some of my Lakota friends remind me of this repeatedly, mitakuye oyasin. We are all related. And if we stop thinking about water as this thing that we can just throw away and buy and sell, and think about it as that which runs through the very veins of our bodies, that which is necessary for every bit of our lives, that which we baptize our children with, that we brush our teeth with, that we would wash our loved ones with, that can be dramatically transformative. So let me just ask all of your listeners, do you know where your water comes from? Most of us, I think, will say it comes from the tap. Aldo Leopold once said that there are two spiritual dangers. He's not a spiritual writer, so it's interesting he says this. There are two spiritual dangers that come from not owning a farm. And one is you think that your heat comes from the furnace, and the other is you think that your food comes from the grocery store. And you fail to remember that both of these things actually come from the land that you live on. And our water in Sioux Falls, our water in Brookings, our water in this whole region actually comes from a lot of other places. The water I drink from my tap falls as snow in the Rocky Mountains. And when it melts, it comes down the Missouri River. And then we pump it out of the Missouri River over 100 miles from my house and purify it on the way. Where does it go next? Now, my big brother lives in New Orleans, and I always like to rib him about this because he has to drink the water that I flush.
Yeah.
And it's just, that's me getting back at him for all those times that he was rough on me when I was a kid. But seriously, we should be thinking about where our water comes from and where it goes and what kind of neighbors we're being to the people who live downstream from us. And these are things that are already present in the indigenous cultures that were here before Europeans arrived in South Dakota and in this whole region. Those are things that we should be teaching each other, reminding each other of. They should be part of our school education, and bring that together with a kind of a culture of fostering innovation. I think we could make some big changes and make them quickly.
Don, what is the role of the artists, the poets, the fiction writers, the nonfiction writers, the journalists, the people who are in that realm of storytelling?
I'll say I've done some work. I did some writing for Sierra Magazine about Hollywood and how they're looking at scripted entertainment and how environmentalists are portrayed, how climate change is portrayed. And, obviously in this research they found was, a very small amount of climate change mentions. And in my own research, environmentalists are often the scold, they're often the nag. And if you go to watch Marvel movies or Bond movies, they're the villain now. And so storytelling is powerful.
Give me an example of
Well,
an environmentalist who's like the butt of the joke in film that people might recognize.
Oh, I think there's a great Modern Family episode where a neighbor is, he's a naggy environmentalist. And he gets salmonella from his solar oven cooking chicken. I mean, and so we're all watching this going, yeah, he got what he deserved, somebody smart. And so I think that's a problem, but there's actual an opportunity there as well, because when we're watching our favorite show or reading a book or a movie, it connects with you in a different way. It connects with you in an emotional way. And the work I've done in the environmental movement for a long time is a white paper after white paper or scary headline after scary headline. And no matter what happens, people get desensitized by that. And I think there's a whole new avenue in storytelling, and not just quote, quote, storytelling, but actual fiction, movies and television and it doesn't have to be about the issue, but that issue has to be part of the story. And I think when we carry it along, you run with your favorite character through the forest, you're part of them then. That's the way we kind of take these stories in and then maybe internalize them, as opposed to pushing all this bad news away, because we're surrounded by so much bad news now.
Yeah. You started by talking about the story of being at Falls Park and sitting on the. I didn't go to Falls Park when I was in high school because that's not where I was allowed to go. But you were there,
Well, I don't know if I was allowed to go there, but
sitting on a
yes,
battery.
sitting on a car battery. Yes, I remember it was an old Milwaukee Light that I was savoring on a car
You
battery in
did not
Falls Park.
invite me to that
I
party.
apologize. I apologize. It was,
All right. We graduated from high school together in case you haven't picked that up yet. But the I wanted to talk about story and our stories of is there and I'm curious for each of you if there was a time that something that was happening in your life inspired you to either rethink your relationship with the natural world or pull you more deeply into the work that you do today. And let's start with you.
sure. I mean, I think I've had to think about this a lot with the book and getting out
Yeah.
there and talking about the book. But I realized in high school when I was on the debate team, the national debate topic that year was water quality. And so my partner and I were able to actually go. We won state. I don't want to brag up here, but we won state on a on a debate term about how we clean up Homestead gold mines water pollution. And so it was in my blood for a long time before I started. And then being part of a family that has a farm, that is actually, part of it as well as you're really connected to, because, grow up in Sioux Falls, you're not that connected to the natural world, but through that farm, I've been connected as well to the natural world. And that's really helped as well.
Yeah. So debate and having to look into it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. At what point did you make the connection that some of the things you were seeing in the river in our backyard were bad
That
and
didn't
not
happen.
just like that's how it is?
That didn't happen until later, and I've told this story before too. I used to be a big pheasant hunter, like a lot of us are, growing up in South Dakota, and we used to rely on CRP walk-in areas a lot. It used to be everywhere, and you'd get your little map out to be creased by the end of the season, and you'd find your own little honey holes that hadn't been, carved out by then. But the ethanol mandate came along, and it was a huge boost in terms of what we did to grow grains in the country, and it was a huge boost for farmer income. But it had the detrimental effect of plowing under a lot of marginal land, and a lot of these areas that I used to hunt for pheasants got plowed under and were now replanted. And so when that came, when I learned about that, that really hurt me because I liked that land so much. And I think that's when I got a little more activated about the work.
Yeah. David O'Hara, tell us a story.
When I was a kid, I grew up in the Catskill Mountains in New York, about 2 hours north of New York City. And when I was a kid, there was a drought that lasted a couple of years. We lived right near the Ashokan Reservoir, which is one of the major water supplies for New York City. My dad and I would go to the Ashokan where we had a rowboat, and each week we'd see the water level going down further and further. And my dad's an engineer. He taught me just a bunch about the importance of water and how engineers have helped move water so far. During that drought, we were watching TV. All of our television came from New York City, and there was a live TV broadcast, and you could see out the window behind the broadcasters, behind the TV hosts, and it was raining, and there were people out in the street dancing, saying the drought is over, the drought is over. And I realized they don't know where their water comes from. Their water comes from where I live. And they thought because the rain was falling in Manhattan that now their water was, going to be available to them. This didn't make me into a scold. It made me wonder, what am I missing? And I started spending a lot more time in the streams around me, just looking and seeing what is all this, what's under this rock? How is this related to all sorts of other things? Where does my water come from? It was kind of a moment of sparking wonder in me and a lot of playfulness in the river too.
Yeah. Jay Gilbertson, where does our water come from?
You're what live here in Sioux Falls.
Here
A
in
good,
Brookings. Yeah,
as we've heard, a good deal of it starts in Montana, but the city gets its water from three different sources at this point. The largest is the Lewis and Clark Regional Water System. There are a series of high capacity wells down along the Missouri River, southwest of Vermilion. It's pumped up the hill, treated, and through a 54-inch pipe comes up to Sioux Falls. The city also has an extensive network of wells in the shallow Big Sioux Aquifer along the river going north toward Del Rapids, and then also out along Skunk Creek. And then finally, a small amount, but sort of an increasing amount, or rising back up again, comes directly from the river itself. There's an intake up on the northern side of town. And so it takes all three of those sources to provide the water necessary for the city.
Where will our water come from in the future?
Also, a very good question. It will probably have to come from the river, from the Missouri. Um, no one is out of water right now anywhere in South Dakota, but most places, including Sioux Falls, can look ahead not too far down the line and realize that their ability to continue to grow is going to be limited. There's only so much water available. We are using, we have appropriated, if we're not using all of the water in the Big Sioux Aquifer, in southern part of the state. And so when we get to where we're using all of it, not holding some in reserve, then the next guy who comes to town, Don wants to move back to South Dakota or wants to move out here, he's going to have to bring his own water. And so we either need to find new sources locally or go to the one place where there's plenty of it, and that is the Missouri River.
And go ahead, jump in.
Well, I just want to on that. I work a little bit right now with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, and one thing I learned about with that group was the Great Lakes Compact of 2009, which the communities that live around the Great Lakes they saw the future, and they saw Western America drinking all the water, watering their very hot lawns with all the water, and realized they need to protect that. And so now it's illegal to take even a drop of water out of the Great Lakes for any other use intended for except for the communities that live along Great Lakes shorelines. So South Dakota is going to have to do some of the same hard choices and thinking about future water choices.
Jay, do you have, well, before I ask you about a story of how you kind of pulled into this work, the obvious question, and it's too big of a question for this panel discussion, but where is a good place to explore further, which is who has the rights to get that water from the Missouri River, because it's not necessarily us.
Well, no, the river belongs to a lot of different people. And depending on how you look at, certainly the river itself, we need a certain amount of flow in the river just for the natural system to be maintained. Here in the West, with the advent of the tribal treaties and establishment of the reservations across, much of the West in the late 1800s, there came with those agreements an implicit right or an implicit access to water at some point down the line. If you're going to take everybody in Western Montana and make them live on a tiny little postage stamp chunk of ground, clearly the nomadic lifestyle wasn't going to be there. You're going to need to do other things. Other things require water. And even though it's not articulated in the agreements, or very few of them, the Supreme Court, starting in 1908, I think it is, said, "No, look, they have a right to some of this water." And in the West, we work under first in time, first in right Western water law. If you were the first one using it, your rights are senior. Well, there's hardly a state, let alone a pre-existing European water right, that predates most of these treaties with the tribes. And so a chunk of the Missouri is also sort of out there. We don't know how big it is yet, but that's for the tribes. It hasn't been articulated, but at some point it will be. And then there's the rest of it that we've allocated since. I think right now there's plenty for everybody, even with the tribal, we'll call the winners' rights. But at some point, that will get to be a problem. And under Western water law, if you're the last guy in, you're the first one out if things get gnarly. So we need to start thinking about that. There's enough water in the river for South Dakota. I believe that. But we're not very big. Denver might look at that and say, "Ooh, cool. There's a lot of water up there. And if you don't have any, the cost is not really an issue anymore." If your existence is dependent on water, the fact that it will be expensive water is of no concern to anybody. So,
Is there a time that you changed your mind or opened your heart or got into a line of work that you didn't expect because you learned something that pivoted your
uh,
career trajectory?
well, I've been a geologist. My degrees are in geology. I've been in this business for a very long time. Um, I don't point to one thing, but within the context of my work for the district, um, 10, 15 years ago, I got a call from a local water treatment plant operator, and he was concerned because the hardness of his water, the amount of dissolved calcium and magnesium, was going up, and that he'd never seen that before. And if you're running the water treatment plant, you want chemistry to stay even, and it was misbehaving. And in the end, what we discovered was this was a rural water plant up in Moody County, is Lake Poncet earlier that year had started to discharge water. We'd come out of a dry period, it was getting wetter. The lake started to discharge into the river. Lake water is hard, and that signal made it all the way down to Moody County and was being picked up at the water treatment plant. And that regional connection, you know, you worry, you know, if I spill my glass here, it's going to make a mess out of the tabletop. Well, no, if something bad happens 100 miles upstream, it can show up down here.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of opened my eyes to, you know, sort of the big picture scale stuff. What happens in the upper basin really does matter in a lot of very particular ways. So,
Travis, how about you? How'd you get into Friends of the Big Sioux River kind of work? Take us back a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, similar to most people in South Dakota, I grew up, you know, in nature, interacting with it. But really, what really refocused my attention is having kids, quite honestly. I have two boys, and, you know, I kind of want them to have some water. And it really instilled this idea of like being a good ancestor. You know, not everything is short-term gain, and how am I going to live to leave the resources as good or better for my kids. So that really focused my perspective on things, you know, and kind of how that's my kind of guiding light. And it's really hard to argue with a guy that says he's just doing it for his kids. So it really helps.
do it for your grandkids.
And my
that's even
grandkids.
better.
That's-
Yeah.
yeah.
Don, we're talking about water rights, and tell us about your next book, because your next book is partially at least set in South Dakota.
Well, it starts in Lake Superior. The middle part is in South Dakota, and then like all good or bad stories ends in Las Vegas.
Excellent. Tease it for us, please.
Well, the South Dakota part, I'm really fascinated by, as we talked before, about the stories we tell ourselves and the stories we tell about the natural environment and the stories that make people do change. And so I'm focusing a lot on Lewis and Clark and the stories we tell ourselves in South Dakota about independence and dominion over the landscape.
Keep going.
I don't want to say anymore. I don't want to. No one will buy it.
Journalistic silence was going to
You
be
told me this earlier, and I was like, "How do I protect myself? How do I do this? How do
so close. I want to end, and then we'll take some questions from our audience. But I want to end with the things that are tangible that are giving you hope right now. The areas where you see progress, the people that you see doing good work. Where are the places that you think, yeah, okay, this is going to be hard, but we do in fact know some things. We're not starting from scratch with what on earth should we do next? We have some of those things. Who wants to begin with that? Something that is giving you some positivity or hope to leave us with today.
I mean, I'll jump up the beginning. Yeah, the youth movement, I think, is really, if you're paying attention to the climate space, the kids are mad and they're furious about the planet that we've given them. And not only they're mad, they're smarter than I was, and they have way more technology than I had to make their feelings and their votes known. And so I think we're going to see that change bubble up from the youth, because we need that.
Yeah. David?
Yeah, I love this place where we live. This place gives me hope. I think about trying to make change in New York City and San Francisco and Chicago. There's these old habits and so many people, but we've got so much opportunity here. I mean, we're an innovative place. You mentioned I was working with IBM to create this global competition. And the year after that, my students at Augustana won the global competition. Students at a little university in a little town in the prairie won this $200,000 prize trying to use tech for good. I think that there's a tremendous amount of possibility here, and we could change the world right here.
We talked with Don about the creative arts, from creative nonfiction to fiction and poetry. Philosophy. Tell me about the philosophy of pragmatism or pragmatic that I read in your bio. What does that mean? And what's the role of the philosophers, the thinkers, the people who are maybe not scientists but want to know more about it? But
The
make
role
that
of the
connection for me. Yeah.
philosophers is similar to the role of the poets and the novelists, except that we're not as good writers.
Please.
uh, the idea of being pragmatic is getting away from dogmatism. And we easily get divided by dogmatism. You got the people who say, no, we've got to do it this way. No, we've got to do it the opposite way. And the pragmatist is going to say, maybe we need to figure out what's going to work right now. And then I'll point to what Travis just said. What can we do right now that's going to make us the step towards becoming good ancestors, towards being good parents, grandparents, great grandparents? And as you were hinting at before, let's think not just for ourselves or even one or two generations. What does the world look like in your very best vision 7 generations from now?
Wow.
What's the best thing you could dream 7 generations from now? And now, thinking in that direction, what's the next step that you take in that direction?
Travis?
Nothing I will say will beat that. But hopeful
It's
wise,
hard to follow David
Yeah,
O'Hara. I mean, let's
I
just
know
acknowledge
what.
that
I'm glad
right
I got
now.
to jump up
Yeah,
top.
The-
Exactly.
that's why you're like, I'll go
I'll
first.
go, yeah.
Yeah.
the philosopher. And, yeah.
He's still the better writer, so bias.
All right.
There's a couple areas. One, we are seeing actual land use changes for the better. Regenerative ag practices are really, are growing slowly, but they are there. So those seeds are planted. No pun intended, but so that's one area. One is South Dakota just has a lot of potential. I like to say we stayed here. My wife and I stayed here because we are good or bad, bigger fish in a smaller pond. The change that we can make is a little bit more than if I went to California. I would be working in one county, which is perfectly fine, but there's going to be a lot of people like us there. So we have a lot of area that we can cover and make progress quicker. We're, arguably 5-10 years behind the coasts in some of these practices, so we can really make large leaps. But kind of going back to what Don and Dave said, we do a lot of education stuff with K through 12 and college students. And like Don said, they are much smarter than we are. And they are already in tune to a lot of these issues. This is just part of their daily life. They think about it already. One of our big goals is to keep them here when they graduate, convince them this is a place worth staying and improving because, nothing's going to get better if everyone leaves, right? So it'll be the status quo. So convincing kids here and, the kids, half of the people we hire come from Dave's class, SCSU, USD. There are a lot of folks leaving our colleges that are very capable of doing this type of work, but we just got to give them the opportunity and that hope
Mm.
that staying here will be worth their while.
Jay?
I think I'm seeing more of a focus on looking forward rather than being reactive. I mentioned earlier here we tend to respond rather than try and act proactively. There was a recent white paper released through the South Dakota Association of Rural Water Systems called Ripples of Change, trying to sort of focus that effort on looking, and your earlier question, where does our water come from? Is look at that a little more closely and figure out how long did it take to develop that resource that we now depend on. We assume, again, I need more water, I'll just open the tap. Well, no, that's not how it works. And with Lewis and Clark as the example, you may be looking at 30 to 40 years before that new supply arrives somewhere.
Right.
And the fact that that's being discussed to me is very encouraging because it really hasn't been a topic of conversation for quite a long time.
A couple housekeeping things. This lovely crew has to work like mad to take all this equipment off for the next person. So I don't want to do a ton of questions. And your questions won't be on the radio because we can't mic you right now. But if you do have a question for the panel, we could probably do one or two. If you just tell me who you'd like to direct it to, there in the blue. Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Conservation.
Sure. Right. We grew up having to share bath water as well in a family of 6, and we lived rural.
Mhm.
So, yeah, whoever got the bath first got the best water. Wouldn't dream of doing that now, to your point, because now it's abundant where I live, and I would not have to. Also, I have 1 child, so I would never make her take a bath after me. Who wants to address just the simple idea of conserving in our homes, in our, in our daily use?
Yeah, I think it comes back to, not knowing where folks not knowing where the water comes from is the first issue. It doesn't just come from the tap. There's a lost relationship of where that comes from
Mm,
and the amount that there is. Um, that is an area of growth. There isn't a whole lot of, as they mentioned, other metropolitan places have gray water systems incorporated in their properties or at a city scale. That's really not happening. There are individual businesses maybe looking into it. There are facilities, newer facilities maybe coming online that would have systems like that, but it's not a large scale thing. So it's a lot of an infrastructure piece and education piece. But I think the first level, and it's kind of sad to say, is getting folks related or getting them aware of water again. Getting that empathy back, getting that awareness back is the first step.
One more right there, please. Mm. It feels like a Jay Gilbertson question. Yeah. Jay, growth? Is
Sure.
there, do we just
Um,
keep growing? How do we,
you are not on the local Chamber of Commerce board, obviously. Um, and it certainly it'd be nice to think, well, Sioux Falls won't, if Sioux Falls doesn't get any bigger because we can't grow, that's not the worst thing in the world. That's a very common sentiment among folks who are already here. But everybody wants to grow, they want to get bigger, they want to do better, however you choose to define that. And if you are part of that leadership in your community, you aren't going to want to tell somebody they can't come here. If I'm dating myself, but if you've an opportunity for the next Saturn plant comes to town, the last thing the mayor's going to do is go, nah, we're good. No, we don't need any more money. We're fine. And so it's very difficult to say no to economic development. That development does not always take place with the idea of, do we have the infrastructure to survive? Or, you know, is there enough water? Or, do we have enough housing? Those are all things that come in, but at the end of the day, somebody says, hey, we'd like to bring 500 more people into Sioux Falls. Most of the time, they're going to be welcomed with open arms, and we'll figure out the details later. So
we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time and your insight and the dozens of years that have gone into just this 45 minutes. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
And be sure to buy Don's